Since Hamas's attacks on Israel on October 7, 2023, and Israel's response, the conflict has sparked widespread discussions covering a plethora of issues. Opinions have varied, with many differing views being expressed. I have been expressing my own views, as reflected in 4 articles I have written and published on my website, The Ward Post. I have also expressed my views on both radio and television interviews back in Jamaica, as well as having my article reproduced in a Jamaican newspaper. But what is clear from much of the discussions in American media, electronic and printed, is that there is no consensus on the nature and the categorization of Hamas's attacks and Israel's responses, both which are continuing with a high possibility of further expansion. There are biases in much of the reporting, but highlighting those biases is not the focus of this lecture. The focus of this lecture is not to predetermine under which category or categories to place the events and the respective actions of Hamas and Israel during the current conflict, nor is it intended to address the conditions predating the outbreak of the current hostilities. In the aftermath of Hamas's attacks on Israel and Israel's responses, we have heard different descriptions of the actions of both sides. The words and phrases most often heard in the reports, comments, and analyses, which have specific meanings related to specific actions under international criminal law, have not been clearly defined in the media and are oftentimes confused one with the other. I have created 2 groups of words and phrases. Group 1 is a list of the crimes, and Group 2 is a list of the actors engaged in these activities. Let me quickly give you the list in Group 1, crimes. 1, terrorism, violent extremism. 2, war crimes. 3, crimes against humanity. 4, genocide. And 5, ethnic cleansing. In Group 2, with a listing of actors engaged in terrorism, I have divided into 2 categories. Category 1, non-state actors, which include terrorists or violent extremists, terrorist groups or foreign terrorist organizations, domestic terrorists or domestic violent extremists, international terrorists or international violent extremists. In category 2, I have listed state terrorism, actors or agents of the state carrying out these activities, and the second listing under that category is state sponsor of terrorism. Each of the terms in these 2 groups of words and phrases have specific meanings. I've already discussed several of these in preceding lectures, so will not be doing so now, except in the case of references. In Group 1, for instance, we have already discussed the elements and conduct of the crime of terrorism, both domestic and international. And in Group 2, we have already discussed the non-state actors listed in Category 1. In my attempt to shed some light on each of the other concepts and their meanings, I can only provide a brief explanation, because it is not possible to provide in-depth details of each. To do so would require separate lectures for each one, an exercise which we do not have the time to do. To be precise, this lecture is intended to provide you with a better understanding of the relationship of the realities and the views being expressed, the nature of the actions, and how they may or may not be classified as terrorism. You may decide on your own conclusions, which may differ from mine. In other words, I expect you to form your own conclusions based on having a clearer understanding of the meanings and nature of the crimes and the role of the actors who perpetrate those crimes. In Group 1, I will focus on war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and ethnic cleansing. Let's begin with war crimes. War crime is defined as, and I quote, an action carried out during the conduct of a war that violates accepted international rules of war. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, in Article 8, defines war crimes over which the court has jurisdiction. The statute defines war crimes as follows: grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions of 12 August 1949, namely, any of the following acts against persons or property protected under the provisions of the relevant Geneva Convention. And I will go through a listing of those here. Willful killing, torture or human treatment, including biological experiments, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health, extensive destruction and appropriation of property, not justified by military necessity, and carried out unlawfully and wantonly. Compelling a prisoner of war or other protected person to serve in the forces of a hostile power, willfully depriving a prisoner of war or other protected person of the rights of fair and regular trial, unlawful deportation or transfer, or unlawful confinement, the taking of hostages. Other serious violations of the laws and customs applicable in international armed conflict within the established framework of international law, namely any of the following acts. This is a very long list. So for purposes of this lecture, I will highlight only those acts which I believe may have some relevance to the current conflict between Israel and Hamas. The first one, intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population as such, or against individual civilians not taking direct part in hostilities. And remember, we are talking here about war crimes. Intentional directing attacks against civilian objects. That is, objects which are not military objectives. Intentional directing attacks against personnel, installations, material, units, or vehicles involved in a humanitarian assistance or peacekeeping mission in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, as long as they are entitled to the protection given to civilians or civilian objects under the international law of armed conflict. Intentionally launching an attack in the knowledge that such attack will cause incidental loss of life or injury to civilians or damage to civilian objects or widespread long-term and severe damage to the natural environment, which would be clearly excessive in relation to the concrete and direct overall military advantage anticipated. Attacking or bombarding by whatever means towns, villages, dwellings, or buildings which are undefended and which are not military objectives. The transfer, directly or indirectly, by the occupying power of parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies, or the deportation or transfer of all or parts of the population of the occupied territory within or outside this territory. Intentionally directing attacks against buildings dedicated to religion, education, art, science, or charitable purposes, historic monuments, hospitals, and places where the sick and wounded are collected, provided they are not military objectives. Employing weapons, projectiles, and material and methods of warfare, which are of a nature to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering, or which are inherently indiscriminate, in violation of the international law of armed conflict, provided that such weapons, projectiles, and materials and methods of warfare are the subject of a comprehensive prohibition that are included in an annex to the statute, committing outrages upon personal dignity, in particular, humiliating and degrading treatment, internationally directing attacks against buildings, material, medical units, and transport, and personally using the distinctive emblems of the Geneva Conventions in conformity with international law. Intentionally using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare by depriving them of objects indispensable to their survival, including willfully impeding relief supplies as provided for under the Geneva Conventions. You will admit that's a very long list of activities that qualify as war crimes. And I'm sure by now it must have gotten you to thinking. Now let's turn to crimes against humanity. Article 7 of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court defines the meaning of crimes against humanity and the actions which constitute these crimes. It should be noted, Hamas and Israel are now engaged in a war with no end in sight. An important distinction between the two belligerents also defines expectations of their respective behaviors. Hamas is a non-state actor, and Israel is a sovereign state. The distinction is important for many reasons. The standards of engagement and the conduct of military operations, war, expected of a state such as Israel, is quite different from that which can be expected of a non-state actor, such as Hamas, to adhere to such principles. I will describe these in some way later, these distinctions. For the record, Hamas is designated as a foreign terrorist organization by the US State Department, the European Union, and others. A resolution proposed by the United States in the UN Security Council on June 1st, 2018, to describe Hamas a terrorist group failed. The vote was 1 in favor, the United States, 3 against, including Russia, Bolivia, and Kuwait. There were 11 abstentions, including the United Kingdom and France, 2 of the 5 permanent members with veto power. Also China, a 3rd member of the permanent members. Had the resolution not been one-sided and had included certain actions by Israel against the Palestinians in Gaza at the time, as had an earlier resolution by Kuwait addressing that conflict in 2018, which was vetoed by the United States, there may have been support for the UN Security Council to designate Hamas as a terrorist group in 2018 and adopt the draft presented by United States. However, the Russian veto of the resolution would have prevented its passage at the time if Russia voted no. It is important to remember, common among terrorist organizations is that they engage in what is described as criminal acts of violence with the aim of wantonly and indiscriminately resulting in mass casualties of civilians. Let's look at genocide. The Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide provides definition and characteristics of the crime of genocide. Article 2 of the Convention provides that genocide means acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. The crime of genocide may take place in the context of an armed conflict, international or non-international. It could be a civil conflict, but also in the context of a peaceful situation. Article 2 of the Genocide Convention contains a narrow definition of the crime of genocide, which includes two main elements. One, a mental element, that is the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And two, a physical element, which includes the following 5 acts. 1, killing members of the group. 2, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. 3, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part. 4, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And 5, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. There must be a proven intent on the part of the perpetrators to physically destroy the targeted group as a whole, or an identifiable part of the group, and not merely individuals of the group. The United Nations has established 4 criteria for the definition of genocide: causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in part or in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, let's turn to ethnic cleansing. The acts of ethnic cleansing could fall within the meaning of the Genocide Convention, that is, rendering an area ethnically homogeneous by using force or intimidation to remove from a given area persons of another ethnic or religious group. The most commonly known example of ethnic cleansing is the Holocaust, but there are several others not as well known. These include the slaughter of the minority Tutsis by the Hutu majority in Rwanda in 1994. Excess of 400,000 Rwandans were slaughtered. The mass killings of ethnic groups in the former Yugoslavia also in the 1990s, such as the Srebrenica massacre in Bosnia in 1995 and massacres in Kosovo. The genocide carried out by the Pol Pot Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia from 1975 to 1979, exterminating some 2 million Cambodians. Many of these are not talked about today. But for each of these, there have been levels of accountability through a series of special tribunals that were established by the United Nations Security Council. American government resettlement of Native Americans, removing them from their original homelands, is sometimes cited as ethnic cleansing. There's also been ethnic cleansing in Russia with the Chechens, and in Darfur by the government of Sudan. For that, Omar Bashir, then president of Sudan, was indicted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity and genocide in Darfur. Because in this particular case, you can see how ethnic cleansing included both crimes against humanity and genocide. There is usually a debate as to what is ethnic cleansing and what is genocide. There's overlap in their nature and effect on the target population. While serious crimes are committed during ethnic cleansing, the act of ethnic cleansing is not an international crime, such as genocide. Ethnic cleansing is not a legal term under international criminal law, but is a descriptive term of actions taken by governments and individuals. The effect of ethnic cleansing may be charged under other recognized international crimes, such as was done in the case of the ethnic cleansing in Darfur. It is important to note the International Criminal Court has linked ethnic cleansing to genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, stating that ethnic cleansing could constitute all three of those offenses which are within the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction. Okay, now let's turn to the actors. In Group 2, let's begin with state terrorism. And note carefully, the simple definition of state terrorism is government activities that encourage violence against its own citizens by paramilitary groups and death squads, often used as horrific warning to other citizens. What are the characteristics of state terrorism? Violence by a government against its own citizens with the aim to frighten them and stifle their dissent. Next, actions take place within its own borders or sometimes abroad. Actions may involve mass murder, assassinations, and torture. It may be politically, ideologically, or religiously inspired acts of violence against individuals or groups outside of armed conflict. Agents of the state carry out these acts, and state terror occurs through the abuse of legitimate power. Here are a few examples of state terrorism. Murders attributed to Russian agents against its citizens living abroad, such as the poisoning of Sergei Skripal, a former Russian intelligence officer, and his daughter, both living in the United Kingdom. They both survived. Also, the killing of Alexander Litvinenko, again by Russian agents, who was killed by radiation poison. Litvinenko was also living in the United Kingdom. And right here in Washington, D.C., the murder of the former Chilean diplomat, Orlando Letelier, along with his colleague, an American, Ronnie Moffett. When Letelier's car was bombed just west of DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C., by agents of the government of Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet on September 21st, 1976. Letelier was living in exile in Washington, D.C., from where he was a critic of the brutal Pinochet regime in Chile. The second state-related form of terrorism is state sponsor of terrorism. That is, a state which has repeatedly provided support for acts of international terrorism outside of its borders. Such support may include 1. Facilitation or direct provision of funding. 2. Providing haven, often referred to as safe haven, within territories under control of the state from which terrorist groups operate, including training, planning, and execution of international terrorist acts. 3. Providing material support, including military-style arms, equipment, military supplies of all kinds, and other related support to a terrorist group. Examples of these often cited are Iran's support for terrorist groups such as Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, both in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthi terrorist group in Yemen. UN Security Council Resolution 2624 of 28 February 2022 designated the Houthi in Yemen a terrorist group. That vote included the US government voting in favor. That's the Biden administration. However, effective as of February 16, 2021, the State Department had revoked the designation of the Houthi in Yemen as a foreign terrorist organization, but retained certain sanctions applicable to the group. The US government explained its decision at the time as being based on giving the United Nations the ability to negotiate with the group to allow humanitarian assistance to the people in the area occupied by the Houthi. In February 2022, the United Arab Emirates, UAE, victims of Houthi terrorist attacks, issued a paper entitled Returning the Houthis to the U.S. Terrorist List, setting out a case to redesignate the Houthi separate extremist group in Yemen as a foreign terrorist organization. The US government has stated that the Houthi rely on the support of the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps, Quds Force, to engage in war with the Yemeni government and incursions into the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Speaking at a news conference in January 2022, President Biden said his administration was considering redesignating the Houthi in Yemen as a foreign terrorist organization. However, due to the humanitarian implications of redesignation, the Biden administration has not done so yet. In the meantime, currently the State Department has designated 4 countries as foreign terrorist organizations, as state sponsors of terrorism: Cuba, Iran, North Korea, and Syria. Syria has a history of support of terrorist groups, including Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda and ISIS, as well as affiliated terrorist groups during the war in Iraq. Libya and Sudan were both on the original list of state sponsors of terrorism, but they have both been delisted. Libya's listing was based on agents of the Libyan government who were implicated in the bombing of Panam 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland on December 21st, 1988, in which 270 lives were lost, including some on the ground impacted by falling debris from the aircraft. American citizens were also included on that flight. Both the UN Security Council and the US government at the time imposed sanctions on Libya. Libyan agents were also implicated in the bombing of a West Berlin nightclub, killing 3 people, including a US service member. In that nightclub bombing in Berlin, 229 people were injured on that April 5, on April 5, 1986. This was a nightclub frequented by US service members, and it was suspected that the Americans were the primary target. President Ronald Reagan responded with bombings of selected targets in Libya, intended to kill Libyan President Muammar Gaddafi. Sudan was implicated for harboring terrorists who planned and carried out the bombings of the US embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, on August 7, 1998. Sanctions were imposed on Sudan by the UN Security Council and by the United States. Cuba was delisted by President Obama and relisted by President Trump. President Biden has been urged to remove Cuba from the list because there is no current justification or rationale for keeping Cuba on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. Cuba was listed during the Cold War. The conditions have changed significantly since then. Let me conclude by saying I have set out for you the characteristics of several international crimes. I have explained the elements of the crimes and the perpetrators. Some of these crimes are committed by states and others by non-state actors. In addition to terrorism, including domestic and international terrorism, with which you are already quite familiar, the crimes introduced in my lecture today, which may be directly or indirectly applicable to the conduct of the Israel-Hamas War, are war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and ethnic cleansing. While these crimes and actions may have common characteristics, you should keep them separate and not conflate one with the other. I've also identified who can commit these crimes: states, non-state actors, or both. Now, having heard my descriptions of state terrorism and state sponsor of terrorism, you should now be able to distinguish between both types of state-related terrorism. In essence, you have now been exposed to two distinct sets of criminal conduct, particularly international criminal conduct, and the way they are carried out. I hope you have found this lecture useful and educational.